All right, let's get into it. We're about to crack open a 450-year-old cold case. And this one's got it all: secret codes, personal attacks, and a pamphlet so explosive that people at the time saw it as a literal declaration of war. What's crazy is that modern historians have pretty much dismissed it. Well, this is the story of how that one forgotten text actually reveals the hidden cracks in the very foundation of Elizabethan England.
So if you just glanced at the Elizabethan church, everything looked pretty stable. I mean, it had adopted a lot of the core theological ideas coming out of Geneva, which was, the heart of John Calvin's Reformation. But how deep did that agreement really go? Was England just a version of Geneva, but with, better music and fancier clothes? A French ambassador at the time really put his finger on it. He saw a church that was thinking like a Calvinist church, but it looked surprisingly Catholic in how it did things. People were still kneeling for communion, the clergy wore special robes, organs were playing. This whole mix of signals was super confusing, and it hinted at a deep, unresolved tension bubbling just beneath the surface. Historians have a name for this period. They call it the Calvinist consensus. It was this time when most English Protestants basically agreed on the big theological stuff, like predestination. But that agreement, it was like putting a thin layer of wallpaper over some really deep cracks in a wall. The real fight wasn't just about theology. No, it was about power, it was about politics, and it was about the very structure of the church and the state. And then, in 1572, that fragile peace just shattered. A fiery debate, fought through these anonymously published little booklets, just erupted in London. It's known as the Admonition Controversy, and it started as a call for reform, but wow, it quickly escalated into something way, way more dangerous. The whole thing really kicked off with two key documents. The first admonition, that was the opening shot, it was a clear public argument demanding that England get rid of its bishops and adopt a system more like Geneva's. But its sequel, the second admonition, it was totally different. It was rambling, it was full of inside jokes and coded language, and this right here is where our mystery really begins.
For the longest time, historians have just kind of written off this second pamphlet. I mean, as the historian M.M. Knappen put it, it's pretty much unintelligible. The general feeling was that it was just a confusing failure, a damp squib that didn't really make an impact and was quickly forgotten.
But, and this is a huge but, here's the twist. Someone who was actually there, Richard Bancroft, who would later become the Archbishop of Canterbury, had a completely different take. To him, this supposedly confused little pamphlet landed with great lightning and thunder. He didn't see a failure. He saw an event that was literally earth-shattering.
So this is the heart of our mystery, right? How could the exact same document be seen as both an incoherent mess and a bolt of lightning? What were Bancroft and his buddies seeing back in the 1570s that we've been completely missing for centuries? Well, the answer is that they weren't reading it as a piece of theology. They understood it for what it really was, a political hit piece. It was a form of anonymous attack that they called a libel, and it wasn't designed to persuade people. It was designed to destroy reputations. Now, to get this, we really need to understand what libel meant in the 16th century. It's not just about telling lies like we might think today. No, it was a whole genre of political warfare. It used personal details, rumors, and super targeted insults to just completely undermine an enemy's credibility and authority. So the second admonition basically laid out this absolutely devastating case against the leaders of the church. It accused them of being secret enemies of the faith. It said they were punishing true believers while letting actual Catholics off the hook. And maybe worst of all, it accused them of betraying the very Protestant cause they once fought for. So how did this code actually work? Well, when the pamphlet started railing against the Polique Machiavells of England, anyone who was anyone knew exactly who that meant. This was a direct shot at Queen Elizabeth's two most powerful advisors, William Cecil and Nicholas Bacon. They were even borrowing an insult that had just been used in a Catholic pamphlet. This wasn't just an attack on the church. This was aimed right at the heart of the government. And the attacks got even more personal. The pamphlet sneers at this prominent churchman who'd apparently rather see all England on a fishpole than actually reform the church. This wasn't just some random insult. It was a coded reference, a bullseye aimed at one specific person, Alexander Noel, the dean of St. Paul's Cathedral. And this attack was just devastatingly clever. See, Noel was famous all over London for his love of fishing. He literally had his portrait painted holding a fish hook. So the pamphlet takes this public image he has and just twists it into a weapon. It suggested he cared more about his hobby than about God's church. And even worse, it implied that Noel, who had once been fished for himself by Catholic persecutors, was now the one hunting down and persecuting true Protestants. It was a truly personal, vicious blow. So now you see it, right? The lightning and thunder wasn't a reaction to some dense theological debate. The church leaders were panicking because they were being personally targeted. This was sedition. The pamphlet was calling them traitors to their faith and their country, and it did it in a way that was deniable but crystal clear to anyone in the know. Matthew Hutton, a senior churchman at the time, saw exactly what was going on. He wrote that this whole fight started over small things, like whether priests should wear certain caps or robes. But now, he said, the attack had grown to target the very existence of bishops, and ultimately, to speak plain, the Queen's own authority over the church. This wasn't a debate anymore. It was a challenge to the entire structure of the state. And Hutton's great fear was political. You see, a Presbyterian system where every local parish chose its own minister, that might work just fine in a little city-state like Geneva. But if you tried to do that in a massive, diverse kingdom like England, he didn't think you'd get reform. He feared you'd get pure chaos, with parishes choosing anyone they wanted. It would completely undermine the monarchy and lead to total disobedience. And this brings us right back to Richard Bancroft. He summed up the threat in one chilling phrase. He said the pamphlet made it clear that if the Puritans didn't get what they wanted through Parliament, they would be their own carvers. In other words, they would take matters into their own hands, with or without the law. This was a threat of revolution.
And so there we have it. The mystery is solved. The second admonition wasn't a confusing failure at all. It was an incredibly effective piece of political warfare. Its coded language wasn't a bug. It was a feature. It let it deliver this message of personal betrayal and seditious threat right to the ruling class. And they didn't just hear it, they felt it like a thunderclap. So why does a dusty old pamphlet war from the 1570s even matter today? Well, because it pulls back the curtain on the whole myth of a stable, unified Protestant England. It shows us that this so-called Calvinist consensus was actually paper-thin, and it was barely concealing these deep, bitter divisions over power, authority, and the future of the nation itself. Which leaves us with one final, pretty provocative question. 70 years after this whole pamphlet war, England would descend into a bloody civil war, a conflict that pitted Parliament against the king and tore the country apart over many of these exact same issues. So if these were the cracks already showing in the 1570s, you have to wonder, was that future conflict already becoming inevitable?